Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm Rebecca Lawrence and this is Voices. In this set of interviews, I will be focusing on issues of inclusion, diversity and allyship through intimate conversations with wine industry professionals from all over the globe. If you enjoy listening, please consider donating through ItalianWinePodcast.com. Any amount helps us cover equipment, production and publication costs, and remember to subscribe and rate our show wherever you tune in. Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast with me, Rebecca Lawrence. Today I'm joined by Cara Bertone to discuss the work she's doing with Lift Collective. Welcome to the podcast, Cara.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I wondered if you could start by telling us a little bit about how Lift Collective came about and also how you came to be their vice president.
So Lift Collective was formerly Wonder Women of Wine, and the name change happened last year. But just to give you a little bit of a understanding and background, I think you also had Rania Zayat on the podcast before, and she's the founder of Wonder Women of Wine and now Lift Collective. So the name change actually happened sort of during the pandemic, but I think it was something that was probably going to evolve anyways, just by the nature of it. So Wonder Woman of Wine was great in getting direction for the nonprofit and sort of like, wanting to pay attention to voices that just have not been heard. And historically, women's voices just don't get heard a lot in the wine industry or in a lot of industries, to be perfectly honest. And so there was somewhat of a movement. And I believe that, you had Wonder Women of Wine here in Austin, Texas. You also had Batonage Forum in the northern part of California. Assemblage came about also back in 2019. So there's quite a bit of this sort of collection of grassroots organizations that were coming up that really wanted to start paying attention to some of the things that just aren't getting talked about in the everyday happenings and business of wine. So that happened, and previous to me joining Lift Collective, I had actually started a local group here in Austin, Texas. There was a group of us, women sort of in leadership roles within Austin, and also women who are aspiring to have leadership roles in the wine industry in Austin, Texas. And so I just sort of put together a group of thought leaders, really, and sort of like, how can we pioneer and change? And Rania was one of those people that I brought into the circle. And after many great conversations between Rania and myself, she asked if I would join Wonder Women of Wine with her as she was forming a 501c3 and needed board members. And so I sat down and had a meeting with the board members, and it was sort of kismet. It was sort of instantaneous. You get around a group of people and you realize, like, wow, okay, great. This is exactly something that I want to be a part of. Literally, the second that we get into having a board and forming the 501c3 and getting ready for our second second conference that was going to happen in late March of 2020, we all know what happened. So it was somewhat of a shock, I think, because you're 1 year out. You've had one actual event that's taken place, the conference that happened in March of 2019, which was extremely successful. And now we had more people. We had some learnings. We were going to change things, develop stuff for an in-person conference in March of 2020. And when that sort of fell apart during the beginning of the pandemic, there were so many things that were happening. There were quite a few other organizations that decided to sort of pivot quickly and move everything onto a virtual platform, their conferences, which was great. I want to tell you that was nowhere in a space or an understanding that we were ready to take on during the beginning of the pandemic. I have two young children. They're now 6 and 4, but then they were just turning 5 and 3. So it was extremely challenging in so many respects, time-wise in particular. But, so many people are losing their jobs. Best friends, I've been in the industry for 20 years, and just seeing I started off in restaurants. So seeing a lot of my friends who had dedicated, a good chunk of their lives, just their jobs going poof. And that's it. And then if they had some sort of vested interest, or if they were founders of restaurants or restaurant groups, their fortune was gone. Not fortune, but you understand what I'm saying? Like, everything was just gone. And so, there was a lot to sort of sit and digest, I think. And so when we first started having these conversations of what do we do next? I mean, there was probably 3 months where we all just sat and really tried to understand what was happening in our own worlds versus just jumping in. And so at the middle of May is when we started having conversations. Okay, let's think about taking some of these panels that we were going to have live and pivot to a virtual setting. And the first one we thought about was diversity, equity, inclusion panel. And we got on a call with what would have been the moderated one of the panelists, and we just started having sort of this open discussion. And from the time that we set the call up in May to the time we actually had the call in June, the murder of George Floyd happened. And so this set amongst just so many different things at this point in time of how many marginalized groups there are within the industry, but just more in particular, don't have a voice. And so when we start thinking about Wonder Women of Wine, yes, women don't have a voice in a lot of scenarios, but we're not the only ones that don't have a voice, right? So women of color have a lesser voice than white women in the industry, right? And so on and so forth. You can go down sort of a rabbit hole, but what we started thinking about and realizing is that yes, we are fighting for something, that's great and wanting to do things for women to help elevate them, but it's not just about elevation of women, it's elevation of marginalized groups in general. So the more that you elevate marginalized groups as a whole and as a collective, the more you can accomplish, because we're not separate, right? We can't separate ourselves out. We have to be able to do this as a community. And, that initial conversation led to our job fair, Be the Change job fair that happened first in December and then in April. So those conversations literally, once the idea of the job fair came up in discussion, it was probably about 60 days of us sort of going out, asking a couple of people, what do you think about this idea? Do you think, would you be able to support this idea? And within 60 days, it was sort of like, if you don't do this, you'll be sad. There was no way we couldn't do it. So it was something that just came, it was born, and it had so much energy and so much life to it, and so many people involved in the helping of producing it that we had to go that way. And so once that first job fair was done, Rania really sat for a long time looking at, ideas of new names, because she knew at that point that Wonder Woman of Wine, it's not that it wasn't a great name in and of itself, but it really didn't embody what we needed to be doing as a whole. So we wanted to have all voices included. And so Lift Collective was then born, name-wise, out of that. And so we still have a huge women base for Lift Collective for sure, but we have a lot more voices that are coming in and a lot more community members that are involved that aren't just solely women, which is great.
I think it's really interesting to see, how that developed, and also that you guys were brave enough to take the decision and say, we did have this initial direction, but we recognize that there's more to be done, and we can still do that. All we need to do is just broaden the net a little bit, and we can welcome so many more people. And like you say, lift so many more people in this way and give this broader understanding of what needs to be happening in the industry, the sort of changes that need to be made. I think it's really important that you made that decision to go, no, we're not just going to stick with this because it's how we started. You adapted incredibly quickly to recognizing the other needs that were out there. I did want to ask a little bit about Be the Change and maybe what the feedback from that has been and the sort of ongoing impact of that, because it's quite an unusual thing. You don't have inclusivity job fairs really, and it's actually an unusual format generally, I think, for the industry. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you hope to get from it and what you have gotten from it.
It's a extremely learning curve. So I will say that the running joke in the beginning was, we're not in the business of job fairs. We're going to do this because we know it's needed in the industry. People need jobs. People are being disproportionately affected. With all of these grassroots women's organizations, you have the same thing happening in other marginalized communities. So you have Black Wine Professionals, Hue Society, Roots Fund, Wine Unify, Psi Unity, all of these different organizations that really are trying to help affected marginalized groups or breaking into the industry as a marginalized group. How do you do that? And there are so many things that we're learning right now I know more about job fairs now than I ever thought I was ever going to know in my entire life. I know way more about online event platforms than I ever thought I was going to know in my life. And it's great. But what I do know in the short term, what we've learned is that there's so much more that needs to be learned in this space. So what the idea is now is to really sort of start bringing in way more voices to this to help build it better, period. So what we've learned is that, or what I've taken from it, quite frankly, is that the wine industry itself is really sort of marketed directly towards consumers that aren't necessarily have any sort of marginalized background, right? So there's so many people who just don't think about wine as a concept of something that they would enjoy as a beverage. It's sort of a very specific group. And so how do you invite groups into something that doesn't really identify them as a group that should be marketed to? There's so many things and so many onions to like unpack on this. What we've learned is that there's community within each of these smaller groups that is really sort of driving this desire of wanting to change. And so the only way there's two huge things that are happening. So we are working with organizations to help build a candidate base, a base of a group of people who are looking for jobs that are of marginalized communities. We, by no stretch of the imagination, we are completely inclusive as an entity. So if you are a middle-aged white man looking for a job in the beverage or wine space, wine and spirits now, come to the job fair. That's okay. We want everyone to be there. We don't want this to be exclusionary by any stretch of the imagination. But what we are doing is making sure that we're working with organizations that inherently have a base or a community that is marginalized in nature, if that makes sense, right? So what we're bringing in are going to be people who are looking for jobs that maybe haven't typically been in the industry. And so what we're sort of trying to figure out now is that like there's not a huge, like a big story about how do they fit in. How do you fit in when this industry hasn't done it? So what's happening right now? So you have this candidate base that is interested in the wine industry, wants to be part of the wine industry, has great capability. So they may have come from restaurant, maybe they came from other CPG, consumer product or packaged goods, other parts of the industry, just not beverage yet. But what we're realizing is that, you know, from a top-down level, we have the opportunity to bring people in. But if the culture isn't inviting, how do you get them to stay? If it's not inclusive, how do you get them to stay? And so that's the biggest challenge. And so the first job fair was all about, let's get this messaging out there. Let's try to find jobs. But we were also in December of 2020, so we're burgeoning on the winter, the big winter where nobody knew what was really going to happen, right? So most budgets for hiring were really sort of tight for big organizations. And so we saw some people get hired, but we saw more people get hired probably in that March, April sort of time frame. So once budgets came out, once people were ready to like actually put on paper how much they were willing to spend, but everybody was sort of dedicated to this, like, let's change the face of the industry, which is great, you know, hiring managers, HR directors, right? But really what we need is the vision to come from the top down. So it doesn't matter if you're pulling people in, if they get in and they don't see anybody else that looks like them or that thinks like them, right? Then what's the point? Right? So the second job fair really leaned into that idea of having conversations with executives. Really like, look, this isn't just about a feel-good story. If you're not changing the structure internally or organizationally for it to make sense to include more voices and different bodies, like this is pointless, because this is going to be an exercise. I mean, think about it this way, you know, back in the 1990s, it was all about, you know, women didn't have, you know, the numbers weren't there. Like, so men still made up 70% or 75% of this industry. And so everybody did this mad push to invite women in hiring women. So now we're closer to 50-50. If not, women might have more jobs. When you look at the equity of it, men are still earning 70 to 75% of the dollars, even though the numbers are the same. And that to me is like just mind blowing. So there has to be this discussion of, this can't be another ticking of the box where we just bring in a bunch of bodies to say that we did this thing. it has to come from the top. There has to be a different leadership that understands what it means. And quite frankly, the next generations, if you don't pivot now. So the second job fair was really about having these hard discussions with people at the top. And it's going to take time for that discussion to filter down, but the magnitude in which people are putting dollars towards this change internally is unlike anything I've ever seen before. So you're seeing a lot of organizations that are out there with fluff who tick the box by celebrating Pride this month by posting on LinkedIn or with an Instagram or whatever. And you see that and you sit back and I sometimes I have to just take a deep breath and know that, that's where they're at. That's where they're at in their journey. And at least they're there and not completely out of the journey. And then you have other people who are really sort of pioneering this like want and desire for change. So we had a leadership panel, a DE&I executive insight suite, where we took Robert Hansen from Constellation, Atira Charles from Moet Hennessy, and James Harris of HEB. That panel was so charged and poised for understanding of what people are definitively trying to make a mark. Like, we're not going to sidestep this anymore. We are really going to implement things that provide inclusion practices within our internal structures. There's been a lot of talk about people like incorporating implicit bias training, which that's great. But I learned about my implicit bias. What does that mean for how I am going to continue acting? Just because I know that I have implicit bias doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to change my actions. How do you change actions? Having ERG groups, great. So you have ERG groups where people can get together and talk about, some of the things that they can do to change that. Those are awesome. But also when you have a microcosm inside of something as big as a large wholesaler, but it's these small groups, it's a loop. It's like a sounding board. So like you actually don't get out, right? And so you stay sort of confined in. And I mean, internally in a lot of I'm not going to name names, but you have, like women's groups within organizations. And inside of those women's groups, it's like there are these leadership groups where there's, like a woman of higher stature is supposed to pull a younger woman, bring them up. If you don't have anyone from your executive team attending those, male executives attending those to help understand and identify what may be issues internally, you can't leave that up to women to change that. You have to be in the room listening. So I think a lot of times what happens is again, you throw money at this thing, you're hoping it's going to change. But if you're not involved in the process, it's not going to change. So what we're hearing now is that is coming down from some of these really key players in the industry. As soon as they start implementing things and they can start identifying key, like if you can grab key ideas from different, industry leaders, it's a matter of time. It will take time, but things will start to fall in to place. So it's little bits by little bits. And so what we're learning now, we partnered with Thurgood Marshall College Fund for the April event, which was amazing. And so we actually reached out to their scholars that were graduating this year for May graduation. And so we invited them to join the job fair, which is exciting. One of the things that I learned most about this, and mind you, the job fair happened 2 days after the verdict of Derek Chauvin. And so a lot of the candidates that would be coming in from could be coming in from Thurgood Marshall, I think had a lot of our candidates had something completely else on their mind. It was an interesting week, let's put it that way, for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that I started thinking about is that, I had this idea in mind, it's, I think, 60 different colleges that they're connected with. So it's historically Black colleges and universities that are public that are within the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, like umbrella. And so what we had is we were working with their team that sort of sits at the top, and then they would go out to each of their universities and sort of let everyone know that there's a job fair, or come join us. What I started thinking about too is that, like, well, if we have never as an industry really sort of catered to the desires or wants or needs or anything of some marginalized communities or Black communities, they might see this job fair and just think, why would I don't drink wine. or, like, none of my friends are in it, none of my family members are in it, nobody's been in it. Why would I do that? So there's so many ideas that I started thinking about, like, wow. So for like next go around, it's sort of like, how do you engage that next generation to want to be a part of this industry, right? How do we become a cool industry that really is trying to, diversify thought in how we are looking at humanity and how we are making sure that we're paying it back to the Earth's resources as well. Like, how can we be more thoughtful in how we are looking at this industry as a whole, right? And I'm a firm believer in sort of benefit corporation ideals, triple bottom line. So you're not just looking at profits, you're looking at multiple different things across the spectrum for how you look at business and being more holistic and thoughtful about business. And so that's when I started realizing that, it's not even that it's a much bigger problem on our hands, but we are so antiquated and we're so steadfast on being, this is the way it's always been, and this is the way it's always going to be, and you're not doing it right. You have to do it this way. There's really not been a lot of opportunity for intentional innovation, really. So we've just been stuck, I think, culturally in this industry for so long. So that's sort of like the next iteration of my mind, is how do we make it really not just about bringing in marginalized groups? How do we make this more holistic for everyone to want to come in and be a part of this industry? And that's something that is a big takeaway for me, how we're going to shift next with Live Collective, with Be the Change, with anything that I'm sort of working with.
Yeah, I was actually, you've managed to basically preempt all of my questions. Because I was gonna talk to you, ask you to talk a little bit about this idea of, it's not just a problem of non-inclusivity in the presence of diversity, but also an environment in which all people can feel comfortable and welcomed. And this process can't just start from grassroots. It has to come from every level, I think, of the industry. And I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about what other changes you think should be being made in corporations. And I think this idea of the kind of triple bottom line is a really interesting one for people to consider.
Triple bottom line, circular economics. Like when you think about capitalism, woohoo! I mean, you could dive into that conversation for hours, days, months, whatever. But really, all you're doing is stealing from one thing to create something out of somewhat nothing, right? So there's nothing that gives back when you look at the true capitalism model, and you're not worried about what happens to finite resources. You're not worried about what happens to your stakeholders or the people who work for you. You're worried about people who have given you money to create this thing so that you can create more wealth for them. We have to be looking at this as a more holistic way, because if you don't, I mean, climate change. Let's just, we could talk about this for forever, but until you see that. And what I'm seeing right now, and it's something that's big for me, is that I see a lot of universities that are actually offering now in their business classes and schools that, the thought process is it can't just be about profitability anymore. And so you're seeing that dynamic and you're seeing that education happen right now. But how long before those people make it up the ladder, right? So if we can somehow start seeding those possibilities, those conversations now at the executive level, right, and people start managing that up, then I think that we will see more of that. Truly, all it takes is one or two companies to make that switch in this industry, and it's going to change, I think, quickly. I mean, one of the so there's a benefit corporation certification, B Corp certification. There's only a few wineries that have done it. So you see it more in the beer industry. You don't really see it so much in spirits, but Fetzer Vineyards signed on an early adopter for benefit corporation B certification, which I thought was like, really? Fetzer did that? I had this idea of what I thought, who I thought would be early adopters, but you have, I think, either Solena or maybe Sokol Bloss or somebody, a couple of those in Oregon. Oregon's got quite a few smaller producers that are certified as well. But all it takes is one big adopter to sort of come in and start making that shift internally, because as soon as, I mean, if you think about it, if you're working from a holistic viewpoint, your supply chain will have to change as well. So if you're looking internally about like, oh, we need, grape resources, let's just go buy a whole bunch from XYZ in Spain, right? And their southern part of Spain, there's plenty of resources, right? We don't have to worry about depletion of resources here in the US. I mean, if you start looking at them and saying, hey, I need you to tweak a few things, maybe can you guys look a little bit of a, regenerative agriculture? Can you start taking a look at a couple of different things that would better sustain our relationship and our business? It's not just about the quick profit, but it's about long term. Once you start having those conversations, then if it's part of who you are, investors coming to you that are putting money in are also in that same mindset, right? So it brings it all the way back. And sorry, sometimes I talk in...
No, it's great. It's great. One of the things I was going to say and bring up is that I think there's historically been this idea that working in a holistic or sustainable way is mutually exclusive to working in a way that might be profitable. And one of the things I think that I'm hoping we're going to see is that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You do need to make a profit as a company. You do need to be a company that can sustain itself, because not least you need to be able to pay the people who work for you. But this doesn't have to mean that you can't put these things into practice. That you can't start looking at more sustainable or holistic ways of working within your company, your corporation, and that by bringing those in incrementally and gradually, you can still make potentially big changes. Like you say, it just takes one large company to say, okay, we're going to change this small part of what we're doing and see what impact that has. And then suddenly there's that lovely ripple effect where that works, so it just broadens out. And I think this is something that companies really do need to be considering as a sustainable business model.
I believe that we're on the precipice of that right now. So I believe that there are a lot of people that they're just trying to figure out how to roll it out. That's what I think is happening. And so I think that you are going to see a couple of big business companies in the next 1 to 2 years that are going to roll out some pretty hefty plans on how they plan on, combating climate change internally, but like also, like making sure that they are looking at their employees, their stakeholders of their business, and how they can better impact and help those stakeholders. It's not just about shareholders, right? So it's about really believing in their team and letting their team sort of help drive what goals they have into the future. But yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Like there's got to be implementation, and I think from the conversations that we had conversations with so many different organizations and so many different executive level conversations where I just sat back and let them sort of, some people love to talk at you because that was their, it was their microphone moment to talk to somebody about, their ideas. And some of them were just that, talking at you, but some of them you could see the spark in the back of the head. Like it wasn't something that they had read and regurgitated to you. It was something that they were really sort of feeling, and they were just trying to figure out how they could. I'm going to be working with these 4 leaders across the company to see if we can implement this and make sure that we're doing it in a correct way. And they were also bringing in other middle level management to the conversation, which I thought was also great, right? Because if you just have this team of people, of executives only thinking that it's almost this reverse mentorship in a way, right? So you bring down, and other people have these ideas that this never get to the top because nobody ever sits down and listens, right? Which is great. So yeah.
Yeah, we could be at a really exciting point for the industry in so many aspects of the industry. So I'm going to lighten the tone a little because it is the Italian Wine Podcast, and I can't let you go without talking about Italian wine. So I wondered what your history is with Italian wine. Is maybe there a particular wine that represents your experience of Italy, that's your sense memory of Italy?
So my last name is Bertone. I'm half Italian, and my family, my grandmother is from Naples, and my grandfather, he would tell me that he was from Sicily, but really he was from Molise, but he spent his I want to say late teens, early 20s in Sicily, and so I think that was cooler for him to say Sicily than Molise was. I will say this. So when I got into wine and restaurant side of things, and I was working on the floor and beverage director, and I would go through phases, right? So something would be cool. So like, all sauce was all of a sudden like, epiphany, mind blown, right? Like, oh my God, it's sun-kissed, Riesling or whatever, right? So you go through these moments. So then it was, whether it be Germany or then I would go to Australia, wherever. There was always like this 6-week thing. And I remember going through this sherry phase, which is not a good phase to go through on the floor of a restaurant, I'll tell you that. I'm sure my guests liked me, but I don't really know how much I remember from those days. So I went through all of these sort of like, not ebbs and flows, just different. I was so excited about wine. And so I was always excited. Burgundy was a huge favorite. Nebbiolo, obviously, like who doesn't love Nebbiolo? But I remember specifically going through this Chianti phase. I was probably 25 or 26 at the time. And I remember thinking in my head, like, okay, I'll get through Chianti and then I'll be on to the next thing. But Chianti to me was such like this like funny thing because, Chianti, especially at that point in time, Chianti was like, oh, you don't drink, you hear that you're not supposed to drink Chianti, but all the cool kids were drinking Sangiovese. And I was sort of like, am I supposed to like it? Am I not supposed to like it? But I fell in love with it. I mean, and I started doing all these classes on the different types of Sangiovese from Tuscany all over. And I'm just like, oh my God, the idea that Sangiovese can be so different yet have this theme, no matter what area of Tuscany then you're in. Sangiovese is Sangiovese, but it's so completely different, and it's not it's total. And you understand in that moment why there are so many different names to Sangiovese because it's got its own identity, just dependent upon where it is within the region. So for me, and to this day, my wife is not allowed to touch this, like she's not allowed to touch the Chianti unless I say that. And what I mean by that is like everyday drinking. Yes, I do have some of that. It's right here. And you can have this section over here, but this stuff over here, even though it says Chianti, just don't touch it. Okay. Just don't, right. Unless I open it. That's terrible. But I'm such a lover, and I'm so nervous. Like I don't want anybody opening up one of those special, like the fact that they're doing cruise right now. I worked for Folio for a minute, and so Ricasoli had come in, and Ricasoli's cruise are mind blowing. They're mind blowing, and they're so good. And so to this day, so that was 25. I am almost 43. It still hasn't gone away. Like, I love it. So, but Italy in general is just a rule of thumb. Like, you can get stuck in Italy. People love France, and there's so many great, like this is Burgundy, and this is this, and yes, there are nuances and things, but there's something about Italy to like where you can get in and you just get lost, and you're like, okay, I'm cool. I'm cool to be lost. That's fine. It all tastes great. I'm fine. So yes,
kind of exactly what happened to me. I fell in love with Tuscan Sangiovese, and that was it. Like I just dived straight in, and I've never surfaced.
Right, exactly. Like you could totally get. I mean, again, if that's my deserted island sort of thing. When people are like, "What are you going to drink?" I'm like, "Oh, it's Sangiovese all day." Wait, wouldn't you want a white one? Like, I guess I drink more white than I do anything else, but like. But if I'm going to be stuck somewhere and that's the one thing I have to drink, it's Sangiovese.
Oh, kindred spirits.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cara, thank you so much for joining me on the Italian Wine Podcast today.
Yes, thank you.
It's been such an interesting conversation. Where can our listeners find you online or on social media?
You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. I don't do a whole bunch of stuff on social media, posting wise, just because I have kids. So I leave it. I sort of leave it up to Rania does a lot of the posting for Lift Collective and for Be the Change. So I sort of let her like run with it. But yes, you can find me on both of those.
Yeah, so for our listeners, check out Lift Collective, check out Be the Change on Instagram, LinkedIn, their websites, all the social media. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow us on social media, subscribe, and of course, donate on the website so we can keep these great conversations flowing.
Listen to the Italian Wine Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Himalaya FM, and more. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the show. If you enjoy listening, please consider donating through ItalianWinePodcast.com. Any amount helps cover equipment, production, and publication costs. Until next time, Cin Cin.